Dr. Marcus James stood by the window of his office, looking out at the gray sky, heavy with clouds. It seemed that the sky reflected his inner state, just as gloomy and depressed. Today, he had to make a decision that would be one of the hardest in his career. His mind was consumed by thoughts of a recent event. An elderly patient, Henry Thompson, had been admitted to the emergency department and made it clear from the start that he was unwilling to accept help from a black doctor. Henry was known in the area for his racist views, and even in a critical situation, when his life hung by a thread, he couldn't hold back his hatred. "I won't let this person take care of my health." His words, spoken with contempt and anger, echoed in Marcus's mind. Dr. James felt anger and resentment welling up inside him, but he knew he had no right to give in to these emotions. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to calm down. His duty as a doctor was clear: to save the patient's life, regardless of his prejudices and hatred. But the inner conflict, the struggle between his personal feelings and professional duty, was eating him up inside. He remembered his father's words, who often told him, "Son, you have to be stronger than their hate. You must be an example to those who can't see beyond their prejudice." These words had always given Marcus strength, but today they seemed insufficient. He knew that the day ahead would be tough. Henry Thompson refused to sign the consent for surgery, demanding to be treated by a normal doctor. Marcus saw not only sympathy in the eyes of his colleagues, but also a hidden sense of relief. No one wanted to take on such a patient. But he knew he couldn't let hatred and racism defeat his professionalism. Marcus understood that despite all his efforts, he might face even greater racism after the surgery, but he wasn't going to back down. Marcus walked down the hospital corridor, heading to the operating room. His steps were confident, but inside, he felt a tremor running through his body. In the operating room, everything was ready. The patient was prepped, and the surgical team was preparing for a complex procedure. Henry Thompson was under anesthesia, and his face, usually twisted with hatred, now looked peaceful. How can a person harbor so much hate and still deserve to be saved? Marcus thought. But he knew the answer. Every person deserves a chance at life, regardless of their beliefs and actions. This was his moral stance, and it helped him through moments like this. Nonetheless, Marcus couldn't help but wonder, what if Henry continues to hate him even after he saves his life? How does he deal with this inner conflict? How does he continue working, knowing that patients like Henry exist? The operating room was silent, interrupted only by the sounds of medical equipment. Marcus's colleagues looked at him with respect, but their eyes also showed concern. They knew that the decision to treat Henry had not come easily to him. When Marcus made the first incision, all doubts and fears faded into the background. Now he was focused only on one thing: saving a life. During the surgery, he felt his hands move with precision and confidence that he had honed over the years. Every step was deliberate and calculated. Every minute was precious. At some point, he realized that this wasn't just a fight for the patient's life, but also for his own convictions. Marcus knew that his strength lay in his professionalism and humanity, and that he had to set an example, even if the patient hated him. The operation was a success. Henry Thompson was stable, and the surgical team left the operating room with relief. But for Marcus, the ordeal wasn't over. Just hours after the surgery, he received news that Henry, upon regaining consciousness, began accusing him of incompetence and deliberately making a mistake. "That black man nearly killed me," Henry shouted, and these words spread through the hospital like wildfire. Marcus stood in his office, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on his shoulders. He understood that despite all his efforts, the world wouldn't change so quickly. How much longer will I have to fight this? He thought, looking at his hands, which had just saved the life of someone who was now accusing him of nearly killing him. But Marcus didn't let these thoughts break him. He understood that the path to justice and equality was long and arduous. He knew that every case like this was another step toward changing the world, even if today it seemed unattainable. At that moment, he realized that his strength lay in his resilience and commitment to his principles, despite the injustice and prejudice around him. Leaving his office, Marcus felt his heart fill with determination. He did what he had to do, and he wasn't going to let hatred and racism win. He would continue to fight, not only as a doctor, but as a person who believes in equality and justice. This victory was not so much in saving Henry's life as in maintaining his dignity and humanity despite all the obstacles. Before we continue, remember, racism is a disgrace. Your likes, subscriptions, and comments all help promote the video so that more Black people can see it and feel supported. The best comments will be featured in the next video. Together, we can change the world. Marcus James sat in his office, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. A tense silence hung around him, broken only by the occasional sounds from the corridor. The doctor's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, turning his inner world into a chaotic vortex. This time, it wasn't about saving a patient's life, but defending his honor and professional reputation. Henry Thompson, the elderly patient Marcus had recently operated on, was now accusing him of incompetence. The memories of the operation were still fresh in Marcus's mind. He had done everything possible to save Thompson's life, despite the patient's openly hostile attitude and blatant racist remarks. But now, with Henry's life out of danger, he was demanding an investigation, claiming that Marcus had made a mistake on purpose. These accusations not only wounded Marcus, but also forced him to confront a reality where professionalism often doesn't matter in the face of prejudice. He looked at the papers in front of him, the beginning of an internal investigation meant to determine the validity of the accusations. Suddenly, he felt uneasy at the thought that his years of hard work could be undone by unjust accusations. How can they so easily forget what I did for this man? He thought, feeling anger slowly give way to despair. But he couldn't afford to break down. A fight lay ahead, and he wasn't going to retreat. With each passing day, the pressure on Marcus intensified. Colleagues who once respected him as an experienced and talented doctor now looked at him with suspicion. Rumors circulated in the hospital, and although no one spoke out against him officially, Marcus felt the coldness in their gazes and the way conversations died down as soon as he entered a room. It was unbearable to realize that his professionalism was being questioned because of prejudice and racism. Marcus often noticed how his colleagues exchanged glances when he walked by. They seemed to be discussing him behind his back, trying to determine how serious the accusations were. One day during lunch, Dr. Henderson, with whom Marcus had once been on good terms, approached him. Marcus, you have to understand that many people here are worried. Henry Thompson is a well-known man in this town. His words can affect everyone's career, Henderson said with icy calm. Do you think I could have made a mistake because of his skin color? Marcus asked, looking directly into his colleague's eyes. But Dr. Henderson just lowered his gaze and, unable to find the words, quickly walked away. This moment made Marcus realize how deeply entrenched prejudice was in society, and how difficult it was to fight even those who called themselves his friends. The day of the investigation committee meeting arrived sooner than Marcus had expected. He spent the entire day before the meeting in thought, preparing for his speech. In his mind, he replayed all his actions during the operation, trying to find even the slightest mistake. But he remembered nothing. He knew he had acted professionally and in good conscience, but that might not be enough to convince those already biased against him. When he entered the meeting room, he was met with cold stares from the committee members. The air was thick with tension. Marcus felt his heart quicken, but he didn't allow himself to show weakness. Taking the floor, he calmly but firmly presented his arguments. He described all the steps taken during the operation, his efforts to save the patient's life, despite Henry Thompson's prejudice. "My duty is to save lives, regardless of how patients treat me," Marcus concluded, looking each of the committee members in the eye. The committee listened to his arguments, and although their faces remained impassive, Marcus felt that his words had made an impact. When the meeting ended, he left the room with a sense of relief. He had done everything he could to defend his honor. Despite the prejudice he had faced, Marcus realized that he would never abandon his principles. Truth and professionalism would always be on his side, even if the world around him was sometimes unjust. Dr. Marcus James stood by the window of his office, watching the city move slowly outside. He couldn't focus on what was happening beyond the glass because his thoughts were centered on something else entirely. The whole city was buzzing with news. The story of the conflict between him and Henry Thompson had become public. The media had latched onto the story, blowing it out of proportion. Marcus knew that this day would come, but he still wasn't prepared for how it would affect him. Messages filled with hate, threats, and outright insults began pouring in as soon as the news spread. A thought pulsed in his mind. Why do they hate me so much for simply doing my job? These thoughts served as a reminder of how deeply racism was rooted in society and how easily it could manifest in even the most mundane situations. Each message, each hateful comment felt like a blow to his heart. Black doctor kills white patient. This charlatan should be punished. Who can you trust if not white doctors? Such phrases repeated over and over. Marcus felt this hatred consuming him, pressing down on his chest, leaving marks of pain and despair. But at the same time, a fire of determination began to burn within him. He knew he had to keep fighting, despite all these attacks. Despite the waves of hatred and threats coming from all corners of the country, Marcus began to notice that not everything was so bleak. Amidst the hateful messages, words of support started to appear. His patients, whose lives he had saved, began writing letters and sending messages, expressing their gratitude and support. "Dr. James, you saved my life, and I will never forget that. You're the best doctor I've ever met," wrote one of his former patients. Marcus felt warmth spread through his heart as he read these words. They helped him cope with the overwhelming waves of negativity, giving him the strength to keep fighting. However, the harassment didn't stop. People called his home, left hateful notes on his door. Once, his car was vandalized with offensive graffiti. At the hospital, many of his colleagues began avoiding him, fearing the backlash from public opinion. But despite all this, Marcus wasn't alone. His support grew with each passing day. Letters arrived from colleagues he had worked with before, from people he had never met but who knew of his professionalism. Doctors from other hospitals, even from other countries, began speaking out in his defense. These people wouldn't let him break. Amidst all this chaos, Marcus was offered to participate in a television debate where the topic of racism in medicine and society would be discussed. It was a chance not only to defend himself, but also to tell the world about what he faced every day. He knew this could be his moment, his opportunity to speak the truth that many avoided. The day of the debate arrived, and Marcus, despite the inner tension, felt confident. The studio was filled with people, cameras capturing his every move. When the host introduced the topic, Marcus opened his mouth for the first time to speak about what had troubled him for years. Racism is not just a problem of skin color, it's a problem of attitude towards a person, their professionalism, and their place in society, he began. His words rang out loud and clear, and with each phrase, he felt the tension in the studio rise. He spoke about his personal experiences, about how difficult it was to break through prejudice and hatred. But he also spoke about those who supported him, about how they helped him maintain his faith in justice and truth. At one point, he noticed how the host's eyes, initially skeptical, began to soften. The audience held their breath. After his speech, there was a brief silence in the studio, but it didn't last long. Applause erupted, becoming the climax of this whole story. Marcus realized that his words had resonated, that he had reached people, even if not everyone. It was his personal triumph, his victory over hatred and injustice. Dr. Marcus James walked slowly to the door of his home, his thoughts tangled in a web of frustration and anxiety. After the conflict with Henry Thompson became public, he felt like the world around him was beginning to crumble. Tensions at work intensified, and at home he hoped to find refuge, but doubted whether he could feel any peace, even there. When Marcus opened the door, his wife Lisa greeted him. She immediately noticed the weight on his shoulders. Looking into his eyes, she saw the exhaustion and worry. Lisa stepped closer, embraced him, and Marcus felt all his anxieties fade into the background, if only for a moment. "I heard what happened," she said quietly, leading him to the living room. "How are you?" "What happened at work?" Marcus sighed, sank into the couch, and buried his face in his hands. "It's worse than I expected, Lisa. Henry is demanding an investigation, and the whole town is talking about this case. I don't know how it will affect our lives." Lisa sat down next to him and took his hand firmly. "We'll get through this, Marcus. You did the right thing, saving a man despite his hatred for you. But I'm worried about us, about the kids. How will this affect them?" Marcus looked at his wife, fear flickering in his eyes. He knew their children had already faced racism, but he hadn't thought this situation could make them even more vulnerable. The next day began with troubling news. As Marcus headed to work, he already knew that the wave of negativity wasn't subsiding. Lisa tried to remain calm, but anxiety clung to her. She saw how their children, Sarah and Michael, were becoming more withdrawn with each passing day. When the family gathered for dinner that evening, the atmosphere was tense. Sarah, holding her fork, could barely hold back tears. "Dad, at school," she began, but her voice trembled. "At school, kids started laughing at me and Michael. They say our dad killed a white man." Marcus felt his heart clench. He glanced at Michael, who was silently poking at his food, avoiding eye contact with his father. "I can't stand this," Michael finally burst out, throwing down his fork. "Why are people so cruel?" Marcus felt a sharp pain in his chest, realizing how much his children were suffering from the injustice and prejudice of those around them. He knew he had to do something, but felt that the situation was only getting worse. "We are strong," he said, trying to inject confidence into his voice. "We have to stand together and fight for justice. We can't let hatred tear our family apart." But his voice carried pain. Inside him, a conflict raged. How could he protect his family when he didn't know how to cope with this onslaught of hatred? Shortly after dinner, Marcus and Lisa found themselves alone. They sat in the kitchen, embracing in silence. The quiet was oppressive, and finally, Lisa broke it. "Marcus, I see how much you're struggling. I see how this is tearing you apart. But know this, you're not alone in this fight. We're all in this together, and we'll make it through." Marcus looked at his wife, her words resonating in his heart. He realized that his family was not just his support, but his strength. They faced this injustice together, giving him the confidence that he wasn't alone in his fight. "Lisa, thank you," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "You're right. I can't allow myself to break. We'll fight together, and I won't give in to this hatred." Marcus felt a new strength growing within him. This strength came not only from his internal struggle, but from the support of his family. He was ready for new challenges, knowing that his family would always be by his side. With this thought, he stood up, hugged Lisa tighter, feeling the anxiety begin to recede, giving way to determination. Determination to fight for justice, for the future of his children, and for the truth, no matter what obstacles might stand in his way. Marcus James sat at his desk, trying to focus on paperwork, but his thoughts kept returning to recent events. The weight of realizing that his fight against racism had gone public didn't leave him. He knew that now every move he made would be under close scrutiny, and it was weighing heavily on him. At that moment, his phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. On the other end of the line was a man Marcus had heard of, but never met in person. The leader of the local black community, Mr. Green, offered to meet to discuss the current situation and offer his support. This news caught Marcus off guard. He was used to fighting alone, relying only on his inner strength, but now he was being offered the chance to unite with others who were also fighting for justice. Inside, Marcus felt conflicted. He knew he needed help, that he couldn't continue to fight alone, but at the same time, he feared that joining the community might lead to even more publicity and increased pressure on his family. However, Green's offer seemed sincere, and Marcus decided he had no choice. He agreed to the meeting, hoping it would be the start of something important. The meeting with Mr. Green took place in a small cafe, tucked away from prying eyes. Marcus stepped inside with some trepidation, glancing around. Green was already waiting for him at a corner table, and Marcus immediately noticed the resolve and confidence in his eyes. "Dr. James," Green began, extending his hand, "I'm glad you agreed to meet. Your story has touched many of us. We see in you a man who can be a voice for those who have been ignored for too long." Marcus felt a new wave of nervousness wash over him. He had never sought to become a symbol of struggle, but he understood that his story could help others. The conversation with Green was difficult. Marcus realized that his involvement in the movement against racism could lead to significant changes not only in his life, but also in the lives of many other people. "I never thought I'd find myself in this situation," Marcus admitted. "But if my story can help, I'm willing." Green nodded, understanding what Marcus was going through. "It's important for people to hear the truth," Green said. "Your participation could inspire others. We're planning a rally in your support to show that you're not alone. This will be the first step toward change." Marcus nodded, feeling the tension inside him gradually give way to determination. He knew that more challenges lay ahead, but now he had support. He wasn't alone. The day of the rally arrived. Marcus stood backstage, feeling his heart pound in his chest. Before him was a crowd of people ready to support him in his fight for justice. He had never seen so many faces turned toward him with such expectation. This was a moment he had never anticipated, but now he stood before the crowd, ready to speak the truth. When Marcus stepped onto the stage, applause and shouts of support erupted from the crowd. He felt the nervousness subside, giving way to confidence. The microphone in his hand felt heavy, but it was the weight of responsibility that he was ready to bear. "Thank you to everyone who came today," Marcus began, scanning the faces in the crowd. "I stand before you not just as a doctor, but as someone who has faced injustice and prejudice. We all know how hard it is to fight racism, how painful it is to experience it, and see how it destroys lives. Marcus's voice grew stronger with each word. He spoke about his experiences, the pain he felt confronting injustice. He talked about the fears for his family, about how difficult it was to make decisions knowing they could affect others. "But today I stand here because I know we can change things," he concluded. "We can fight for justice together. My story is just one case, but it can be the beginning of change. We cannot remain silent. We must act." The crowd erupted in applause. Marcus felt a new strength settle in his heart. He was no longer alone in his struggle. His personal story had become a catalyst for social change, and he was ready to continue this path, knowing that thousands of people were walking it with him. Henry Thompson sat in his living room, his hands nervously running along the armrests of his chair. It had been a few days since he was discharged from the hospital, and each day brought a new wave of condemnation. Henry was used to being a respected figure in his community, but now his standing had been shaken. People he had considered friends and allies began to treat him differently, with suspicion and even restrained contempt. At first, he dismissed it as temporary misunderstandings, but the hints and disapproving looks were becoming more frequent. A phone conversation with his old friend Frank had been a real cold shower. Henry had expected support, but he heard something entirely different. "Are you serious, Henry? Do you really believe that Doctor was trying to harm you?" Frank's voice was full of skepticism. "People are saying that you just couldn't accept help from a black doctor. Do you realize how this looks to others?" Frank's words echoed in Henry's mind, leaving him in complete confusion. How could he, Henry Thompson, who had always considered himself an honest and just man, find himself at the center of such accusations? He suddenly realized that his usual views and beliefs had become a symbol of injustice and prejudice for many, and this burden began to weigh on him more and more. Dinner at the Thompsons' house was marked by a silence that no one dared to break. Usually noisy and lively, the family was now steeped in quiet. Henry felt that his children, Kate and Josh, were hiding something, and this only heightened the tension. "What's wrong? Why are you so quiet?" Henry finally asked, looking at his son and daughter. Kate, usually so confident and outspoken, glanced quickly at her brother before responding. "Dad, we talked about what happened to you at school today." Her voice was tight, as if she was struggling to hold back her emotions. "Do you really think Dr. James tried to harm you just because he's black?" The question, posed by his own daughter, struck Henry deeply. He had never thought his children would doubt him, but now, as Kate voiced her thoughts aloud, Henry realized that his beliefs were affecting not only his reputation, but also his family. "I don't know what to think," he mumbled. "I just felt like something was wrong. But now that you mention it..." Josh, who had been silent until now, suddenly raised his head and blurted out, "Dad, you realize that's just prejudice. I don't want my friends thinking you're a racist." These words hit Henry in the heart. He felt the wall he had built around his beliefs begin to crumble. His children, his pride, were disappointed in him, and this disappointment carried not only personal pain, but also the realization that his views could destroy their trust. Henry couldn't sleep that night. Thoughts of his actions and words kept swirling in his mind, giving him no rest. He realized he could no longer deny the truth. His accusations against Dr. James were not the result of a medical error, but of his own prejudice. Henry understood that he hadn't wanted to admit this fact because it would mean acknowledging his own wrong. Early in the morning, before the family woke up, Henry made a decision that was the hardest he had faced in years. He dialed the hospital's number and asked to be connected to Dr. James. His heart pounded in his chest, and he wasn't sure he could express everything he felt. When Marcus answered, Henry took a deep breath. Doctor, James, this is Henry Thompson. His voice was quiet and hesitant. I'm calling to apologize. I realize I was wrong. I understand now that my accusations weren't the result of your mistake, but of my prejudice. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Marcus, hearing these words, felt a mix of emotions, relief and surprise. He hadn't expected Henry, who had refused to see the truth for so long, to take the first step. "Thank you, Henry," Marcus finally replied. "Your words mean a lot to me, but the most important thing is that you realize this yourself. Admitting mistakes is the first step toward change." This conversation marked the culmination of a long internal struggle for Henry. He realized that racism not only destroyed others' lives, but also his own family. Understanding this became a liberation for him, but also a reminder of how important it was to change, not just for himself, but for his children, who wanted to see a fair and equal world. Marcus James sat at his desk, surrounded by papers and notes. Despite the outward calm, emotions were boiling inside him. The past weeks had been tough. Henry Thompson's accusations, public pressure, the talks at the hospital, all of this had left a deep mark on his soul. He tried to stay strong, keeping up appearances for his colleagues and patients, but inside, a constant battle was raging. When there was a knock on his office door, Marcus looked up, expecting to see anyone but Henry Thompson. As he looked at him, he felt a wave of unpleasant cold wash over him. Henry stood at the threshold, seeming somewhat embarrassed but determined. "Dr. James," Henry began, crossing the office threshold hesitantly. "I came to talk to you. We need to discuss what happened." Marcus froze. He didn't know how to react. On the one hand, standing before him was the man who had accused him of prejudice and jeopardized his reputation. On the other hand, he saw what could be genuine remorse on Henry's face. But could he believe it? "Henry," Marcus replied, forcing himself to speak calmly. "I'm not sure this conversation will do any good, but if you really have something to say, go ahead." Henry awkwardly sat on the edge of a chair. Marcus noticed how his hands trembled as he began to speak. "Doctor, James, I was wrong," Henry said quietly. "I accused you because I couldn't handle my fears and prejudices. I'm truly sorry." Marcus was silent, feeling tension build up in his chest. Henry's words sounded sincere, but could he forgive the man who had caused him so much pain? Marcus sat across from Henry, feeling conflicting emotions flare up inside him. On the one hand, he understood that forgiveness was an important step, one that could change not only his life, but also Henry's. On the other hand, he couldn't just forget everything that had happened. Those accusations, made against him because of racism and prejudice, had hurt him deeply, and now he didn't know if he could trust the man who had caused him so much suffering. "Henry," Marcus began, carefully choosing his words, "I'm glad to hear that you've realized your mistake, but understand that your words have caused me and my family a lot of pain. I can't just accept your apology and forget about everything." Henry seemed prepared for such a response. He sighed, lowering his gaze. "I understand, Doctor. James, and I'm not asking for forgiveness in the hope that you'll just forget everything. I'm asking because I sincerely want to change my life and my views. I realize how deeply I was wrong, and now I need time to correct it, but I'm ready to start with an apology to you." Marcus saw that Henry was genuinely remorseful, but trust didn't come easily. Inside, the struggle continued between the desire to forgive and the fear that this remorse might be temporary, insincere. "It's hard to believe in change," Marcus said quietly, "when people cling to their prejudices for so long. But I want to believe that you've really changed. It won't be easy for you or for me. Henry listened carefully to Marcus's words, feeling hope grow within him for forgiveness. He knew that this conversation was the first step on a long road to redemption, and understood that it wouldn't be easy to regain trust. But this conversation, in which he was ready to open up and admit his mistakes, became an important moment for him. Marcus, in turn, felt his tension gradually giving way to the realization that before him sat not just the man who had wronged him, but someone who sincerely wanted to make amends. This realization didn't make forgiveness easier, but it gave him the resolve to take a step toward it. "Henry, I can't promise that everything will be as it was before," Marcus finally said, meeting Henry's gaze. "But I'm willing to give you a second chance, not because it's easy, but because I believe forgiveness is the path to healing, not just for us, but for those around us." Henry felt tears well up in his eyes. He understood that he had received not just forgiveness, but an opportunity to start a new life. And now he was determined not to waste this chance. "Thank you, Doctor. James," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I won't let you down. I'll do everything I can to prove that this forgiveness wasn't in vain." When Henry left the office, Marcus was left alone, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew that many difficulties lay ahead, but he had taken the first step toward forgiveness, and that brought him a sense of relief and hope for the future. This experience showed him that forgiveness requires not only courage, but also wisdom, and that through forgiveness, true healing can be achieved for both oneself and others. Marcus James stood in the hospital corridor, observing the familiar scenes. Nurses rushing to calls, patients waiting their turn, colleagues discussing the latest news. It seemed that everything was back to normal, but inside, Marcus felt different. After all the events he had endured, he could no longer see his work the same way. He felt that now every step he took, every decision he made, carried more weight. His fight for justice and equality, although not over, had already begun to bear fruit. But along with this came the realization that he couldn't let his guard down, that he had to be even more attentive and strong because now his actions would be scrutinized. Marcus knew that many of his colleagues continued to regard him with suspicion or even disdain. In their eyes, he had become a symbol of something greater than just a doctor, and this made his life even more challenging. But despite this, he understood that he couldn't turn back. Ahead of him was a new life where his personal and professional principles were intertwined, and he had to find a way to cope with that. With each passing day, Marcus became more aware of how his life had changed after the conflict with Henry Thompson. Patients who once saw him as just a doctor now came to him with different words and thoughts. Many thanked him not only for his professionalism, but also for his resilience, courage, and willingness to stand up for the truth. One day, an elderly woman whom Marcus had operated on several months ago walked into his office. She sat across from him, clasping her hands in a gesture that betrayed her inner tension. "Dr. James, I want to say something." She hesitated, and Marcus saw her eyes fill with tears. "I heard about what happened to you. I just want to thank you not only for saving my life, but also for not being afraid to fight for the truth." These words touched Marcus deeply. He understood that his actions meant more to others than he had imagined. On the one hand, this gave him strength, but on the other, it added responsibility. He constantly had to balance his duty as a doctor with the fact that he had now become a symbol of the fight against injustice. But even despite these acknowledgments and words of support, Marcus felt that his inner struggle was not over. He knew that more difficulties lay ahead and that his journey was only beginning. A few weeks passed after Marcus returned to his regular work, but that regular was no longer the same. Every day, Every encounter with patients or colleagues carried something new that made him reflect on how much his outlook on life had changed. After one particularly difficult day, when Marcus had performed several complex surgeries, he walked out of the hospital and sat on a bench in the hospital park. He felt the fatigue slowly enveloping his body, but his mind was still swarming with thoughts of what he had gone through. He remembered all the moments when he had to choose, to stand up for the truth or to succumb to societal pressure. Each of these choices made him stronger, but also left its marks. Now he felt not just like a doctor, but like someone who had realized his mission in life, to protect the truth and justice, despite all the difficulties. Looking up at the dark sky, Marcus felt a new strength begin to grow within him. He was no longer the man who feared looks and judgments. He had become someone ready to move forward despite all obstacles, someone ready to stand by his principles and fight for the truth. His journey wasn't over, but now Marcus knew that every step on this path made him stronger and more confident. He no longer feared the future because he realized that everything he had gone through had made him the person he was meant to be, a doctor who not only heals bodies, but also helps heal souls, both his own and others. Marcus James sat at his desk, surrounded by papers and notes. Ahead of him was an important day. He had been invited to speak at a conference on racism and discrimination in medicine. He understood that this speech would not just be a talk, but a real challenge, one that would show whether he was ready for the changes that were expected of him. Marcus felt anxiety growing in his chest. This was his first experience of public speaking on such an important topic. He had always been a man of action, preferring to speak through his deeds, but now he was faced with the task of expressing all those feelings and thoughts that had been accumulating in his soul over the past months. He would have to speak not only on his own behalf, but also on behalf of all those who had faced injustice and prejudice. Every word he planned to say carried the weight of his personal experience and pain. He knew that his speech could influence public opinion and the perception of racism in medicine, but at the same time, he realized the responsibility that had fallen on his shoulders. It was important not just to express his thoughts, but to do so in a way that would resonate with the audience. Marcus sighed, putting down his pen. Words and phrases swirled in his mind, but they didn't form a clear picture. He needed to find the right tone that would help him convey his message to every person in the audience. He knew he had to be honest, open, and, most importantly, sincere. Marcus spent the last few days immersed in preparing his speech. He reviewed his notes repeatedly, adding new thoughts and removing those that seemed insufficiently convincing. Every time he closed his eyes, scenes from the past came to mind, moments when he had faced injustice and had to stand up for his rights, despite opposition. The night before the conference, Marcus sat in the living room, surrounded by silence. Lisa approached him, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. "Are you ready?" she asked, seeing the tension on his face. Marcus sighed and nodded. "I have to be ready. This is an important step, and I can't afford to make a mistake." Lisa stepped closer, gently squeezing his hand. "You've always been strong, Marcus. You've gone through trials that would have broken many. Your words matter because they come from the heart. People will feel that." Marcus looked at his wife, feeling her support help him overcome his inner fear. He knew he had to move forward despite his doubts because his words could change not only his life, but also the lives of many other people. "You're right, Lisa," he said quietly. "I have to do this, not for myself, but for all those who are waiting for change." The day of the conference arrived. Marcus stood backstage, looking out at the huge hall that was gradually filling with people. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, but with each passing minute, his resolve grew. He knew this wasn't the time for fear. He had to gather himself and do everything possible to ensure that his voice was heard. When his name was announced, Marcus slowly stepped onto the stage. Under the bright lights, he felt the tension rise, but looking at the faces of the people in the audience, he gathered all his willpower. From the first words, his voice was confident and firm. "Good afternoon," he began, scanning the audience. "Today, I want to speak with you, not just as a doctor, but as someone who has faced injustice and racism in his life." He spoke about his personal experiences, about the pain he had to endure, and how that pain had become a catalyst for change. He spoke about the need for reform in the healthcare system, about how racism destroys not only the lives of patients, but also those who are meant to save them. "We must change our system," Marcus declared, feeling his voice fill with passion. "We must ensure that every person, regardless of skin color, receives fair and equal treatment. This is our collective responsibility, and I believe we can make this world a better place." The hall erupted in applause. Marcus stood, looking at the faces of the people, and realized that his words had found their mark. This was a moment that changed him forever. He knew that his voice would now be an important tool for social change, and that he wouldn't stop until he saw real change. Marcus sat at his desk, dozens of letters and emails spread out before him. It had been a few days since his speech at the conference, but the response it had garnered was overwhelming. For the first time in his life, he received so many thanks and offers of collaboration from community organizations, academic circles, and even individuals who had been inspired by his story to fight against injustice. Marcus wasn't usually prone to vanity, but this wave of recognition touched him deeply. He couldn't help but think that his words had truly made a difference in the world, and this feeling was new to him, the realization that he had become more than just a doctor. He had become a voice that people listened to. But alongside the pride in his work, Marcus felt something else: responsibility. He understood that now all his actions would be under close scrutiny, and any decision he made could have consequences not only for him, but for all those who looked to him as an example. As Marcus opened another letter inviting him to speak on television, he felt a wave of anxiety. He was ready to continue the fight, but he knew that new challenges lay ahead. And with each new offer or thank you note, the pressure on him only increased. Despite the recognition and support he had received, Marcus also faced negative reactions. Phone calls, letters, and even social media messages began arriving with threats. Some people, who didn't want change, saw his actions as a threat to their beliefs and worldview. One evening, as Marcus was leaving work, he was stopped by a stranger at the hospital exit. The man's face was hidden under a hood, but the words he spoke were clear and threatening. "You don't understand what you're getting into. If you keep this up, there will be consequences. Don't you think your family should be safe?" These words pierced Marcus like a knife. He knew the fight would be tough, but a threat to his family felt like a low blow. Inside, a storm of emotions arose: fear, anger, and the desire to protect his loved ones. But along with these feelings came the realization that he couldn't back down. To retreat would be to betray all those who believed in him, who saw hope for change in his actions. When Marcus returned home, Lisa immediately noticed the tension on his face. "What happened?" she asked, sensing his unease. Marcus sat down beside her and sighed heavily. "They're threatening me, Lisa. They want me to stop, to stay silent." Lisa was silent for a few moments, considering what he had said before she replied. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, but you've always said that the truth is worth fighting for, no matter what. I believe in you, Marcus, and I don't want you to back down out of fear." These words gave Marcus strength. He realized he couldn't let fear dictate his decisions. He decided to move forward despite the threats, knowing that his fight mattered. A few weeks after that incident, Marcus was invited to a ceremony where he was to receive an award for his contribution to the fight against racism and discrimination. He hadn't expected this, and the invitation took him by surprise, but he knew he had to attend. It was an important moment, not only for him, but for everyone who had supported him on this journey. When his name was called, Marcus stepped onto the stage to applause. He felt a sense of pride and responsibility settle in his chest. The award was presented to him with solemn words, but at that moment, Marcus wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about all those who had suffered from injustice, who had fought and continued to fight. "This award is not just mine," Marcus began, holding the microphone. "It belongs to everyone who has faced injustice but didn't give up. This fight continues, and we can't stop. Our actions today will shape the future, where racism and discrimination no longer have a place." His words were met with a thunderous ovation. But for Marcus, it wasn't just a moment of glory. It was a moment of realization that his fight had become a symbol for others. He realized that his actions were inspiring people, and now he had to continue this path. That evening, Marcus returned home, feeling like a different person. He understood that his fight wasn't just his personal matter, it was an example for others, proof that change was possible if you fought for it. This moment became a significant milestone in his life, strengthening his resolve and confidence in the rightness of his path. Marcus James stood by his office window, watching the bustling life of the hospital outside. He had always seen the hospital as more than just a place of work. It was a place where he could impact people's lives, help them in their most difficult moments. But now he realized that his role extended beyond the ordinary. Recent events and public pressure had forced the hospital's leadership to make a decision to implement new programs to combat discrimination and racism. Marcus was appointed to lead this initiative. This appointment was a recognition of his efforts and his struggle, but it also brought new challenges. He felt both excited and responsible. Questions swirled in his mind: how to create programs that could truly change deep-seated prejudices, how to make people not just follow the new rules, but genuinely embrace them. His thoughts were interrupted by Lisa, who entered the office to support her husband before his first meeting with the team. "Are you ready?" she asked, looking into his eyes. Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. "I have to be ready. This is an important step, and I can't afford to fail." Lisa moved closer, gently squeezing his hand. "You'll do great, Marcus. You always do. Remember, you're doing this not just for yourself, but for all those who are waiting for change." These words gave Marcus confidence. He knew there was a lot of work ahead, but he was ready to take on this challenge. Marcus gathered the team of doctors and administrators in the hospital's conference room. Before him stood people he had worked with for years, but today he saw them in a new light. He had to explain why these changes were necessary and how they would be implemented. "We're here to start an important phase in our work," Marcus began, looking around at the attendees. "Our hospital has always been a place where people receive help, regardless of their race, religion, or social status. But we know that problems of discrimination exist, and we must be the first to start addressing them." Marcus's words were met with mixed reactions. Some doctors nodded in agreement, while others looked skeptical. But Marcus was determined to convince everyone of the importance of this work. "We'll develop training programs to help each of us recognize our biases and learn to work in a more inclusive environment. But this is not just about training, it's about changing the culture," he continued, feeling his voice gain strength. "I understand that this will be met with resistance, but if we don't start with ourselves, who will change the world?" One of the senior doctors, Dr. Henderson, raised his hand. Marcus, you know I support you, but isn't this too radical? We have many other problems that need to be addressed. Marcus expected this question. He knew there would be doubts, and he was ready to respond. I understand your concerns, Dr. Henderson, but if we don't fight discrimination now, it will continue to poison our work and our relationships with patients. We need to start with this because it's the foundation of everything, and I believe that together we can make our hospital a model for others. These words made an impression. The team began discussing the details, and Marcus saw how opinions gradually shifted in his favor. It was a difficult conversation, but the first step was taken. Months passed since the implementation of the new programs began. Marcus faced resistance and challenges more than once, but continued to move forward. He knew that such changes wouldn't happen quickly, but every small success gave him the strength to keep going. One day, as Marcus was reviewing progress reports, Dr. Henderson approached him. "Marcus, can we talk?" he asked, visibly anxious. Marcus invited him to sit down and looked at his colleague intently. "I wanted to apologize," Henderson began. "I was wrong to doubt your initiatives. I see that it's working. The atmosphere in the hospital is starting to change, and it's because of your persistence. You've really made our hospital better." These words were the best reward for all of Marcus's efforts. He felt pride and satisfaction fill his heart. "Thank you, Dr. Henderson," Marcus replied, feeling some of the tension lift off his shoulders. "I'm glad you see it that way, but there's still a lot of work to be done, and I hope we'll work together to achieve even greater success." That evening, as Marcus left the hospital, he looked back at the building and realized that he had indeed begun to change the world around him. It was a small victory, but it meant a great deal. He realized that change was possible when people were willing to fight for justice, and that his work was only the beginning of a long journey toward equality and inclusivity. Marcus sat in his office, reflecting on the recent events. Despite all the challenges he had faced, he felt satisfaction with the results he had achieved. His actions had led to significant changes in the hospital, but the journey was far from over. At that moment, the hospital's chief administrator entered his office with a proposal that caught Marcus by surprise. "Marcus, we've all seen the contribution you've made in fighting discrimination and racism," the administrator began, sitting down across from him. "We have a proposal that could change not only your life, but the entire healthcare system in our region. We want you to lead a new program to combat discrimination across our entire network of hospitals." Marcus froze upon hearing these words. This was a huge acknowledgement of his work and achievements, but it also came with immense responsibility. His heart began to beat faster, his thoughts racing. He had never sought leadership at this level, and now he wasn't sure if he was ready to take on such a task. I don't know," he mumbled, trying to process what he had heard. "This is a big responsibility. I'm not sure I can handle it." The administrator looked at him with a smile. "You've already proven you can do a lot. We believe you can handle this, and it could be an important step toward the changes we're all hoping for." These words made Marcus think. He realized that this proposal was a chance to continue the fight at a new level, but the fear of potential failure was holding him back. The next few days were tough for Marcus. He constantly thought about the proposal, trying to weigh the pros and cons. On the one hand, he knew this was a unique opportunity to make a real difference, to change the system from within, to make it more just and inclusive. On the other hand, he felt the immense weight of responsibility, which could prove overwhelming. Each evening, he returned home and discussed his doubts with Lisa. "I just don't know, Lisa," he admitted one evening as they sat together over a cup of tea. "I'm afraid I won't be able to handle it. What if I let down everyone who believes in me?" Lisa listened to him carefully, considering his words. Marcus, I understand your doubts, she began, speaking softly but confidently. But look at what you've already accomplished. You've changed the lives of so many people, shown that change is possible. Yes, this is a big responsibility, but if not you, who else can handle it better? Lisa's words resonated in Marcus's soul, but the fears remained. He understood that the decision he would make would change his life forever, and this fact made his choice even harder. The day came when Marcus had to give his final answer. He sat in his office, surrounded by thoughts and memories of the journey he had traveled. Recalling all his victories and defeats, he suddenly realized that his fears were not about the possibility of failure, but about the fact that he had finally reached a level where his actions could change the lives of thousands of people. This thought gave him strength. He realized that he couldn't let fear control his decisions. Instead, he had to use his experience and knowledge to help others. When Marcus entered the administrator's office, his steps were confident and his gaze was steady. He knew he was making the right choice. I accept your proposal, he said, looking the administrator in the eye. I'm ready to lead this program and do everything possible to make our hospitals a model of fairness and equality. The administrator's face lit up with satisfaction. We never doubted you, Marcus. It won't be easy, but I'm sure you'll succeed. Marcus felt a new responsibility settle on his shoulders, but with it came the realization of his strength and readiness for new challenges. He knew that there was still much work to be done, but he was confident that his experience and determination would help him succeed. In the series finale, Marcus spoke to his new team, outlining his goals and principles. His words were confident, and he saw the faces of the people fill with hope and trust. This was a new chapter in his life, and he was ready to embrace it.